everyone. Welcome to Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. Today is day 38. And so we are in the book of Exodus, and it is chapters 20 through 22:15. Today, if you've been with me for the past, great. If this is your first time, then we are doing the 1 Year Chronological Bible reading plan, or we're using the Bible from the 1 Year Chronological Bible Company. I've said it a million times, but I want to keep saying it. I have no affiliation with the 1 Year Chronological Bible. I just really like it. I love the way they put it in order and the historical way that it makes sense. And so that's why I wanted to follow this one. I know there are other chronological reading plans out there. So diving right in, because there is so much going on here that I'm not going to be able to hit all of it for sure. And there's just certain things that I want to talk about that stand out. But there are some amazing things in here that God is doing with these people. Going back to go forward, we are with Moses and Aaron, who have, through God, have brought the Israelites out of slavery, and they're moving them towards the promised land. And currently they are sort of on the foot of Mount Sinai, and Moses continues to go up and into the mountains and speak. Moses and Aaron go up to speak to God. And then they come down and they're kind of telling what's happening. They're saying what God has done, what God wants to have done. And at this point, the chronological order is a little bit confusing here because some things happen that I'm not 100% sure if they've already happened. And I don't want to go too far into the future, but I do know that this group of people, instead of going directly to the land of milk and honey, which is Canaan, they actually wind up wandering in the wilderness for a very long time. Not 100% sure if that's sort of where we are in their wandering into the wilderness time, or if we are clearly before they go into the wilderness and they're getting all these rules. But it seems to me like a community has been established. But again, I want to be really careful. What we do know is that they are out of slavery and they are moving towards living in the land of Canaan, which is the land that God has promised them, right? So there's this sort of large gap in the middle. There's this 40-year gap in the middle that we're kind of in the middle of, right? So if it's the beginning of the 40-year gap, amazing. If it is smack in the middle of the 40-year gap, then that is okay too. I just want to sort of be aware that it's definitely in the 40-year gap period between leaving slavery, landing in Canaan. Okay, so just so we know where it is. Again, Moses and Aaron continue to talk to God. God is making this really big deal out of himself, and he wants the people to recognize Moses as his mouthpiece. And so he's making a big deal, thunder and lightning, and there's a lot of noise. And remember, they're following him, and he's a cloud by day and a fire by night. So he's making himself obvious, but he's actually only speaking to Moses and Aaron. So they're the only ones who actually get to hear him vocally. And so the others just sort of hear that they hear everything through Moses. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. Again, I'm trying to establish some parameters of where we are so you can get more of a picture. And I was just talking to someone this morning, funny enough, and she said the same thing. She's very visual. So she enjoys watching a movie before she enjoys reading because she likes to see the picture that's been given to her. I'm visual also, but I'm opposite. I like to create the picture and then I like to then see it visually on a screen afterwards. And so different perspectives, but both really visual in this idea of helping to understand. I want to see it in order to help me understand what it is that's going on. So again, I always say to you, I want you to read first. And I know some people have shared with me that they're not reading, they're listening, and that is also amazing. So they're getting context through what's going on, and I hope that that's helping as well. But obviously, I still want you really reading and being in your Bible because God is speaking to you directly through your Bible. Okay, so again, today we are on day 38, moving right into Exodus 20. So one of the things that I want to note that I think is important is that God is talking to the Israelites. So and I'll go over a little bit why this is important, why I think it's important. But God is speaking directly to the Israelites. He's speaking to the people that he has created a covenant with through Jacob, right? So he had a covenant with Abraham. And then if you guys remember when we read back in Genesis, he had a covenant with Abraham. That went down and he continued that covenant with Isaac because Isaac was the son of the covenant. And then he continued that covenant after that with Isaac's son, Jacob. So Jacob was a twin. It was Jacob and Esau. And he continued that covenant with Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. And this covenant now continues. And now this is the tribe of 12 sons. I keep making these same picture references. That's funny as I look at myself. So this is the 12 tribes of Israel that God now has a covenant with. So he's speaking directly to those people. So I am not of the 12 tribes of the covenant. So I need to clearly understand what he's saying to them and what that purpose meant to them at that time. I need to understand as best as I can. I always say very clearly, I want to be really careful when I say it's very clear here that it says, right? Because it might look clear to me and God may have opened that up to my eyes. Like, again, when I talked about it a bunch of times, Hagar all of a sudden can clearly see the well, which someone else may have seen before her, but she didn't see it before then. The well that she drank from, so she wouldn't die and her son Ishmael wouldn't die. And right now, when I see things, to me, they look really clear. But maybe before they didn't, and maybe to you, they don't. And so I want to be really fair with that. And also remembering that this is a translation, right? This is not in the direct Hebrew. So some words, and I'm going to point a couple out because some really stood out to me one in particular really stood out to me this week. Okay. So he's speaking to the Israelites. Now it says in verse 2, so going right away in Exodus 20, verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Boom. Just so you know, I'm the one who did it. I am your God. I am the one that you should be listening to. I granted you this. You were in there for 400 years-ish, right? Give or take. You were in the land of Egypt. And now I have brought you out. You are my people. If you remember in Job, God is this huge God. He is almighty. He is all powerful. He made the stars. He made the moon do what it's doing. The sun do what it's doing, right? He did all. He created us. We know that back in Genesis, he created us and he created the animals. That's God. Right? I am not God. This is the God who's protecting me, following me, and brought me out of slavery as me, an Israelite. Okay, so he's reminding them, he wants them to know, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Now, here we go. These are the 10 commandments. Some of you might memorize them. I have definitely not memorized them. Believe as long as a Christian I have been, I tend to forget. If someone say, what are the 10 commandments? I tend to forget some of them. So, I think the most important one is the reason he reminded them of this, right? That I'm the one who took you out is you don't have any other gods before me. So nothing should be coming in front of me. No other gods, no God of good health, no God of driving, no God of, right? Like, so we need to be really careful in what we put in front of God. So no God before me. And he said, so then he says to them, you shall not even make an image for yourself in the form of any, this is the second, shan't make an image of yourself in the form of anything in heaven or above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. This is the important, so you don't make an image of it. So back then it certainly wasn't a photograph. Don't create an image of anything and worship it. So back then there were idols, right? And if you guys remember from when we read Genesis, Rachel, Jacob's wife that he loved, Rachel took the idols out of her dad's home. So these little formed carven gods. And again, were they to protect the house? Were they for fertility, right? There could be all these little totems of all these kind of things. He's saying, don't create images of anything and worship those things. Don't put any power in anything other than me. Don't worship and give yourself to anybody other than me. All right. The third one is, so no image, God comes before everybody. And then we go, don't misuse the name. So don't use his name incorrectly. And then 5 is remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days, you're going to labor and do your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You guys remember in Genesis, God worked for 6 days and then he rested on the Sabbath. And so here Moses is going to clear it up a little bit for us. He says in verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, because God rested on the seventh day, the Lord blessed that Sabbath day and made it holy. And remember, to be holy means to be set apart. So he took that seventh day and he set that seventh day apart. That day is holy. It was blessed by the Lord. And they are not to work on that day. And if you remember the manna that came just, I think, a day ago, the manna that came, they were not to gather it, right? So he also makes some clear distinctions of what work is. They weren't to gather that food. Not that they shouldn't eat, not necessarily that they shouldn't cook, but they shouldn't be gathering food. So they shouldn't be working on that day. That should be a day of rest and a day to be with the Lord and to be holy. All right, then we go, honor your father and mother. There's a reason. Honor them, your father and mother, so that you may live long in the land of the Lord, your God, who God is giving to you. So you want to honor your father and mother so you can stay in that land, so that that land you will live long in that land. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony against your neighbor. And this idea of your neighbor, I think, is going to come up again and again and again. So who is their neighbor in this instance? I think, here we go with me saying it's clear. I was just about to say it's clear, even though I said I don't want to say it. I think the neighbor here is the Israelite. So they're establishing this amongst their people. Now, remember that there are millions of them. So it's not like there's just a few. It's not like it's a small neighborhood like what I live in. There are millions of them. So, but they are a community in and among themselves. And so they're not going to do this to their neighbor. So they're not going to give false testimony. They're not going to lie to somebody about their neighbor. And then it says you don't covet your neighbor's house. You don't want anything that your neighbor has. You don't want their house. They have such a better house than me. Their wife is gorgeous, right? You don't do any of those things. You don't covet their wife, covet any of their stuff, their animals, whatever they work for. So you don't covet any of those things. So covet to be jealous, right? That you feel like you need that. They have that, so I need that. What did they do to get that? That's what I need to do. Or why did they get it and I didn't get it, right? So those are the things that's sort of internal. That's not as much of an external thing as some of the other things. Okay, now I want to move on a little bit from this, because this says in verse 18, which I think is a really cool and important verse, 18 through 20, it says, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. So remember, this was how God was showing himself. He was showing himself through lightning and thunder, right? So then all the people knew that Moses was speaking to God. God was speaking to Moses. And so then they were scared. So this was a big noise. It was a booming sound. And so they were scared. Actual fear, right? This isn't that reverence fear. This is actual fear. And it says that because they trembled with fear. And it says, and then they stayed at a distance. And they said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but don't have God speak to us or we will die. So they're actually afraid of God. And it could be, which would make complete sense, they watched all the things that he did, right? And he reminds them, I'm the one who brought you up out of Egypt. How did I bring you up out of Egypt? I made it dark in the earth. I brought the gnats on. I brought the frogs on. I brought the locusts that ate everything. I killed the animals. I killed all the firstborn, right, in Egypt. So they know that God is a really mighty God at this point. They saw all the things that were happening. So they were scared. But Moses says, do not be afraid. God has come to test you. Here we go with the so that again. I love these. So that's are kind of my favorites. So that he's testing you so that you will be afraid of God, so that you won't sin, right? So I want to bring this up, and I'm hoping to add this picture in because I want to bring this up. I live in a day and age we are not really, and I live in an area, right, where we're not really afraid of anything. We're not really a docile people, right? Someone says do this and we go, whether we agree with it or not. We tend to say no. I am a Gen Xer, and so almost always the only thing we did was wear black and tell people we weren't going to do the things that they asked us to do. I see generations under me that are doing the exact same thing, and they might not overtly say it. They just might not do it and ignore you. But it's the same thing, right? We are a rebellious people, right? We are not afraid of God anymore. So there's this movie, and again, I'm going to try and add this picture. There's this movie called Dogma, and in this movie Dogma, I'm not going to explain all the details, but they have something called Your Buddy Christ. So I'm going to post a picture of that right here if all goes well. He's the super cool Christ. He just wants to be your friend. He wants to do everything that you want to do, right? He wants anything you want. Like, sure, no problem. I'll give you whatever you want. No biggie. Just ask me. We're buds, yo. That is not who our God is, right? And I'm saying that there's going to be stuff in the future that say things like friend and father and brother, right? And those are all amazing expressions. He is not your buddy that's going to sit in the parking lot with you and break things. That is not the Jesus. That is not the God in which we are talking about. This God is like, hey, see this one that took out those firstborn? And again, I don't think he's trying to scare you in order to say that he's evil. He's not those things, but he is great and he is powerful. And we should have an instinctive fear of that so that we will not sin against him. So when he says, Kathy, I want you to not lie, I'm not going to lie because I'm going to be afraid of that God, because that God, I don't want to sin against that God. I know that God loves me. I do not want to sin against that God who tells me not to lie, because that God can do really, really big things, right? And so he says, I'm going to test you, right? So that you're not going to be, I want you to be scared so that you're not going to sin against me. I'm going to keep you from sinning. So this was put, there were these things, and I want to be careful, right? I want to be careful. I want to be right where we are. I know I've talked about some stuff in the future, but in some ways being right where we are, these people who have known who God was in some ways are now following for a purpose. And we're starting to see what that purpose was. And this purpose is I want you to be afraid of me, and I do not want you to sin. I do not want you as a people group to sin against me. And I'm going to give you all these rules. And I do not want you to break these rules. They break the rules. I'm not saying they don't break the rules, but I'm telling you, I don't want you to break the rules. And when you do break the rules, I want you to be afraid of it, right? I want you to keep from sinning. I know I'm making a big deal out of it. I worry about our generation. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure there are so many others that worry about the same thing for their own generation, right? Some generations probably were like, oh, it was all doom and gloom. And so I was so scared of God that I didn't even recognize how much he loves me. There's this perfect balance, right? Because if you remember a couple of chapters ago, God did everything that he did to take all of these people that he loved so much and save them and bring them into the land of milk and honey, right? So I'm not saying to forget that and to not recognize that this is a loving God who loves us enough to take us and lift us out of slavery, either literal or metaphorical, and bring us into his kingdom, right? So I do not want to lose that balance. But he is also the God who, when you are not following and honoring him, right, there are consequences to those actions. Okay, so I want to have this really delicate balance. And here it is saying, I want you to be scared of me to keep you from sinning. So I want to leave it at that and move on from there, because the next couple of chapters I don't really have as much, because this really establishes sort of a base for me. And then, so moving on to, I think, Exodus 21. I want to move on to, I had some questions about this. So he starts to establish all these laws from here on out, right? So 21 and 22, he's establishing a lot of laws and rules. And one of the things, again, I talked to you about chronological order. It feels to me like these things are being established. If you remember a couple of chapters back, and Moses was judging everything, and his father-in-law Jethro came in and said, this was where they were establishing, his father-in-law told him he couldn't be the judge of everything. And so he needed to establish everything. And then he needed to let the people know all his decrees. And so I'm thinking that this would make sense, that this would be where he's hearing these cases, because some of them are so specific. And so it seems to me that he's hearing these cases, asking God about them, and then God is giving him the answers about what the way things should be established. That's what I'm thinking, right? When I read it, this is the picture that I see. And so he's asking God, and he's writing all of these things down. So there are a couple things that stand out to me. And one of the things that stands out to me is right away in 21 in verse 2. This is that word thing that I was talking about, translation. It says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free. Okay, so there's that, right? And then I want to move on to where it says, so moving on later, we talk about slavery. So later it says on in 21:20, it says, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's actually the same exact word. And so could there be some contextual differences? I'm not 100% sure. For some reason, the translator in this version decided that he thought they were maybe slightly different words. It looks to me like they're the same word. And so they are slaves. They are owned by the people. So these Israelites are, and again, this is why I think maybe it's more of an established community at this point, because if they're just for the first time living under the mountain, they sort of just left. They've just left Egypt. Couldn't spit that out. If they just left Egypt, how did they come by slaves already if they haven't really been in war with anyone or anything? So that's what I'm thinking. That's my take on it. And I also note that it says Hebrew servant, right? And so maybe that's why they made it servant instead of slave, because it's Hebrew. But what I notice is that so Hebrew actually is not necessarily an Israelite. So an Israelite is always a Hebrew, right? One is always the other. So an Israelite is always a Hebrew. However, there are Hebrews that aren't Israelites, which I find really interesting. So all of Abraham's children are Hebrews because the covenant was originally made with Abraham. I'm not saying the covenant passed down, right? Not the Israelite covenant, but the Abrahamic one. So those children who had children who had children who established communities seem to be Hebrews, right? Because if you remember too, when Joseph was in Egypt, they spoke a lot about Hebrews, and if it was only Jacob's family who were the Hebrews, they certainly wouldn't have had anything. It would have been such a tiny little community. They certainly wouldn't have had anybody or anything against them. They wouldn't have necessarily found them detestable. It was that they were a people group. And so I find it interesting that Israelites have Hebrew servants or slaves. And so I'm not 100% sure why that would be. Again, if they were maybe warring in those territories and then they took them as their slaves or as their servants, an interchangeable, I guess, kind of word. I feel like slave has such a bad connotation. And so I guess it's hard for me to say. But again, that is the Hebrew word originally, that it is slaves. And so they have all these ways to treat them. So again, they would have other Hebrews as their slaves. And so what I'm noticing in all of these things, even the whole slave section, right? How you should be treating them, everything should be to the Lord, right? So all of these things that seem to be happening, the answer to all those things is to make the other person whole again, if that makes sense. And it reminds me of today. One of the things that, so even let's say I get into a car accident, right? So taking a really basic example, I get into a car accident and my immediate perception is, let's just say it's my fault, right? I don't even want to tell the police who come in that it's my fault, because then everybody can sue me. And if they sue me, they could be a jerk and they could take my house and they could take my car and they could take my kids' college fund, right? So there's this idea that I feel like I need to withhold information in order to remain whole, because what we do is we try and find loopholes in everything. So let's say it was, for example, my fault, and I say, I would love to make you whole. I will pay for whatever damage happened and I will make you whole. Well, one, the person could have tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage. I don't know. And maybe I would have to be responsible for that. Or so I'm trying to find a loophole that says I don't need to be responsible for that whole sum of money. Right. So we try to find loopholes. Dishonest, again, is not necessarily a word I want to use, but we try and protect ourselves by finding loopholes. And I don't think that's why God established the rules. I don't think he established these laws for loopholes, like, oh, this is what I say, and try and find your way around it. I think he establishes them because he's trying to say, you guys are brothers and sisters. You guys are one family, you're neighbors, right? And so if something wrong happens to your neighbor and you have done it, you need to make your neighbor whole again, right? So we're establishing relationship and community with each other. We are being a people that are set apart from everybody else, right? We're not trying to find a way out. We're trying to find a way to make them whole and to restore them back to what they were. That's rough for me in my life as it is now, because there's so many laws and boundaries and all these other things in place, right? So when I hurt someone, my instinct isn't necessarily to try to make them whole. My instinct is to let it go, ignore it, hope it goes away, right? So I think this whole idea of trying to make the person you have sinned against or hurt, making them whole and restoring them. And so I think that is what God is trying to do. And I also think there are a couple other interesting verses, like in verse 24, he says he's making an altar for himself, and he says, don't use any silver or gold. He says, don't step on it because I don't want to see your privates, which I think is actually really funny. But again, it's all about establishing the holiness of him and the not as significance of us, right? So he is to be wholly separate and different. And then we as his people, or the Israelites, again, I take that back. I want to focus on the Israelites as those people are also supposed to be holy and set apart. So the last little section that I want to read, because Exodus 22, I just feel like is a whole bunch of laws. But in 21, the last little section I want to read is 7 to 11, because another area I found interesting. All right, this is a section about women, and I just kind of wanted to go over it a little bit. If a man says, this is 7 through 11, if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money. So again, I feel like it's about restoring, right? It's about making her whole. But one of the things that I note in here, this is not the same for men, right? Male servants, after 6 years, they're on year 7, they're allowed to go free, right? Wholly free. That's not the same for women. And I know they talk about foreigners in a different way as well. Even again, down in verse 20, anyone who beats their male or female slave, right, they're to be punished. So there's a hierarchy. Again, in this covenant in particular, there is a hierarchy. This is hard. Men, women, slaves, and underneath, right? There's a hierarchy. Nobody is to be treated poorly. Nobody. There is no circumstance under which any of them are supposed to be. Remember, they're supposed to have the fear of God. They're not supposed to be sinning. So none of them are supposed to be treated poorly, but there is a hierarchy in the way in which things are supposed to be taken care of. See it, take it, whatever that means to you. I'm not throwing anything else out there. I'm just saying in this particular land with this particular people, it seems as if, right, there's a possibility that there already was a hierarchy in this world, and God was just working on protecting women from being abused and thrown around, right? So I don't want to say it as if women were less than, because a few chapters ago, I told you Miriam was a prophet, right? Miriam was Moses and Aaron's sister. And so she was a prophet, and Moses was a prophet, and Aaron was a prophet, right? They were speaking the word of God to people. They were encouraging. It looks like Miriam was singing and playing music, right? So I don't want to take anything away, and I don't want to separate in that way that it means that one is more important or more valued than another. It seems as though there are positional positions. And again, I'm going to leave it at that. And then we finish up again in chapter 22, where he just has more and more laws about things that things that have gone wrong maybe, and then he's trying to settle these and make things right. So he's talking about animals in a lot of ways, what animals should do if they kill. Like, so one of the things that stood out to me was that if a bull kills somebody, then that bull needs to be put down. But if a bull constantly kills somebody, then the owner of that bull needs to be held liable for that, right? So again, it's working on making it right. If the guy didn't handle his business and there's something going on with his bull, then he is responsible for that, right? So then he has to make that right. If somehow the bull just went crazy, then that bull just needs to be taken and put down. So again, all these laws that God is working on to make them a unified people, a people that hopefully prayerfully would lift each other up, would hold each other responsible, and then would honor each other, right? So I feel like he's working on that with his people. I'm going to end there today. Things to maybe think about and to work through. And always, I want you to go read it if you haven't read it yet, and you think, I don't have no idea what she's talking about. Go in and read it. You might have a different perspective than I do. I would also love if you would comment. So just interested in hearing some of your thoughts. Some of you have told me that you're watching but not commenting. I would love to hear some of your comments. And maybe you don't have any. Maybe it's just, you're just reading along, and that's fantastic. But thumbs up, like it, share it, subscribe to it, and pass it on to other people so they can be reading their Bible as well. We all want to know more about who God is, and we all want to love him more. So we have a healthy fear of God to keep us from sinning. That's all for today. See you next time.